Here at Jabot Stories, we believe the best stories are born from the most unlikely encounters. Imagine an impenetrable fortress. At its peak, one of the most powerful women in the corporate world, shielded by firewalls and armies of lawyers. Now imagine two children who have nothing but the clothes on their backs and the trust in each other. Normally, their paths would never cross. But today, we're going to tell the story of how a flaw in the system, a door left ajar, allowed chaos to step into order. A story of how two invisible girls became an empire's greatest threat, and at the same time its only hope. Stay with us, because this story begins now. Her leadership was not defined by grand speeches, but by the quiet, unyielding pressure she exerted on the world around her, bending markets and competitors to her will. From her 40th floor office, the city below was a silent, sprawling circuit board, and she was its master architect. Her routine was a fortress built of discipline, a 4 a.m. workout, a review of global markets by 5, and by the time her executive team arrived, she had already fought and won a dozen silent battles in her mind. Today's challenge was a hostile takeover bid from a rival conglomerate, a serpent coiling around the company she had built from the ground up. Her board was panicking, suggesting a merger, a concession. Evelyn, however, saw it as a declaration of war. She dismissed their fears with a single sharp gesture, her gaze sweeping across the boardroom. "Panic is a luxury we don't afford our competition," she stated, her voice calm but lined with steel. "They see an opportunity because they perceive weakness. We will show them they have miscalculated." It wasn't just about business, it was personal. Every patent, every employee, every brick of that building was a testament to her breaking through barriers no one thought a black woman could shatter. She projected an aura of invincible control, but beneath it was a fierce, protective instinct for her creation, a vulnerability no one was ever permitted to see. Miles below Evelyn's panoramic view, in the concrete canyons where the city's refuse gathered, Mia and Lena operated with a different set of rules. Their world wasn't one of stock prices and corporate espionage, but of survival, a complex dance between staying hidden and being seen just enough to get by. Mia, at 12, was the strategist, her eyes holding a sharp, calculating intelligence that belied her age. Lena, 2 years younger, was the heart, her optimism a flickering candle against the harsh winds of their reality. Their bond was their only real asset, forged in the shared hardship of abandoned alleyways and the unspoken promise to never leave the other behind. They survived on a patchwork of strategies. Mia's knack for mapping the routes of bakery delivery trucks for discarded pastries. Lena's disarming smile that could coax leftovers from street vendors, and their combined agility in navigating the city's underbelly. Their life was a constant risk assessment. A rainstorm wasn't an inconvenience. It was a threat that could ruin their cardboard shelter and soak their only set of clothes. A police siren wasn't just noise, it was a signal to disappear into the shadows. They didn't see themselves as victims, they were a unit, a two-person company whose only mission was to make it to the next sunrise. Their shared warmth in a cold world the only dividend that mattered. The event that would shatter both their worlds began with a glint of metal on a rain-slicked pavement. A sudden downpour had sent the lunchtime crowd scurrying for cover, leaving the streets around the Omnigen Tower momentarily empty. Mia and Lena were huddled under the awning of a closed newsstand when Mia's sharp eyes caught it, a sleek black card with a silver emblem lying next to a puddle. It wasn't a credit card. It was heavier, more substantial, bearing a holographic seal and the name of a senior executive. Lena, ever the pragmatist when it came to potential gains, saw an opportunity. "People pay for stuff like this back," she whispered, her breath fogging in the cool air. "Like a real reward." Mia was more cautious. She recognized the building it belonged to, a glass fortress that seemed to scrape the sky, a place they were meant to be invisible to. Handing the card to a security guard at the front door was the obvious, safe choice. But a spark of audacity, a rare and dangerous impulse, flickered within her. This card wasn't just a lost item. It felt like a key to a world so far removed from theirs it might as well have been another planet, a world of warmth, food, and possibilities they could only dream of. The decision was made in a silent exchange of glances, a shared gamble against the life they knew. Holding the executive pass like a fragile artifact, Mia and Lena watched the imposing glass doors of the Omni-Gen Tower. Security was tight, with guards whose stern faces promised no leniency for street kids, but the downpour had created chaos, a river of black umbrellas and rushing employees. "Now," Mia whispered, grabbing Lena's hand. They fell in step behind a harried-looking man, fumbling with his own badge, their small frames and drenched clothes making them almost blend into the chaotic backdrop of the storm. As he swiped his card and the glass doors slid open, they slipped through the gap, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were inside. The lobby was a cathedral of steel and marble, a stark, sterile environment so clean it felt like they were contaminating it just by breathing the air. People in sharp suits moved with a purpose that was entirely foreign to them, their conversations a low hum of incomprehensible jargon. For a moment, the two girls stood frozen, two grimy smudges in a pristine world, clutching the keycard that had brought them there. They had crossed a threshold, not just into a building, but into a reality they weren't prepared for, their unexpected encounter with power and its consequences only just beginning. Their immediate goal was simply to disappear within the vastness of the Omni-Gen Tower, to find a space where they weren't under the scrutinizing gaze of security cameras or the purposeful stride of employees. They found their temporary sanctuary in a small, empty conference room on a lower floor, the door left slightly ajar. The room was unremarkable, dominated by a long, polished table and a dozen empty chairs. But to Mia and Lena, it was a haven of quiet and warmth. It was on that table that they found their second key to this forbidden world, a slim, silver laptop left open and glowing softly. It sat next to a half-empty coffee cup and a scattered pile of papers, clearly abandoned in a hurry. The keycard they had found on the street lay nearby, identifying the owner as a senior vice president, the same man they had unknowingly followed through the lobby doors. The laptop screen displayed a corporate screensaver, the Omni-Gen logo rotating slowly in a 3D space. For Lena, it was a fascinating toy, a window into a life of endless electricity and sleek gadgets. For Mia, however, it was something more. It was a source of information, a potential map of this alien territory. She had a basic, street-taught familiarity with technology, gleaned from watching people in libraries and internet cafes. But this was different. This machine felt like the building itself, powerful, complex, and holding secrets she couldn't begin to imagine. Her curiosity warred with a primal instinct for caution. Touching it felt like a transgression far greater than simply entering the building, but the laptop was open, awake, and waiting. It was an invitation they couldn't resist. With Lena watching over her shoulder, her breath held in nervous anticipation, Mia gently touched the trackpad. The screen flickered to life, revealing not a password prompt, but an open desktop. The man had been so rushed he hadn't even locked his session. The screen was a mosaic of icons and open windows, a digital representation of a life of immense pressure. There were emails marked urgent, calendar reminders for meetings with titles like Board Emergency Session, and most prominently, an open folder labeled Project Nightingale. Mia's finger, smudged with city grime, hovered over the trackpad as she navigated the cursor, her movements hesitant at first, then growing more confident. She clicked on the folder. Inside was a collection of documents with cryptic names: Asset Valuation Q3, Shareholder Comms Draft, Nightingale Defense Strategy V4. She didn't understand the corporate jargon, but the word defense resonated with her. It was a word she understood in her bones. She opened the strategy document. It was filled with dense paragraphs of text, but what caught her eye were the diagrams and charts embedded within it. There were bar graphs showing declining stock values, organizational charts with certain names circled in red, and a complex flowchart that seemed to map out a series of aggressive actions and counteractions. It was a battle plan. She couldn't decipher the specifics, but she recognized the universal language of conflict. One company, their rival from Chapter 1, was the aggressor, its name appearing like a virus throughout the documents, linked to terms like hostile acquisition and asset stripping. This wasn't a document. It was a spreadsheet, a vast grid of numbers and labels that made her head spin. But even without understanding the financial models, she could see the patterns. One column, labeled Projected Omni-Gen Workforce, showed a steady number. Next to it, another column, Projected Post-Acquisition Workforce, showed a number that was drastically smaller, with entire departments showing zeros next to their names. They might not have known what a synergistic reduction was, but they understood what it meant when a big number became a small number. It meant loss. It meant people, thousands of them, would be erased from this company, just as she and Lena had been erased from the world outside. She scrolled further, finding internal email chains that had been copied into the document. The tone was panicked. People were discussing golden parachutes for executives while simultaneously strategizing how to manage the human resources fallout. The hypocrisy was stark and ugly. They were discussing the destruction of thousands of lives with the same detached analysis they applied to stock prices. For the first time, Mia felt a flicker of something other than fear or curiosity. It was a cold, sharp anger. These powerful people in their glass tower were just playing a more complicated version of the games played on the street. Take what you can, crush those who are weaker, and protect yourself at all costs. The weight of their discovery settled upon them, a suffocating blanket of adult problems they were never meant to carry. The initial thrill of their infiltration had evaporated, replaced by a heavy, chilling understanding. They were in possession of a secret that could affect thousands of people, a secret that powerful, ruthless individuals wanted to remain hidden. The laptop on the table was no longer a toy or a curiosity. It was a bomb. Their first instinct, the one that had kept them alive on the streets for years, screamed at them to run. They could close the laptop, slip out of the conference room, and melt back into the city's anonymous crowds. They could pretend none of this had ever happened. It was the safe choice, the logical one. No one knew they were here. They could erase their presence and continue their life of quiet survival. But a new, unfamiliar feeling was taking root in Mia's chest. For their entire lives, they had been invisible, powerless, subject to the whims of a world that didn't care if they lived or died. Now, for the first time, they held a sliver of power. They had seen behind the curtain and understood in a raw, intuitive way the injustice of what was about to happen. To walk away would be to accept that injustice, to consent to their own powerlessness. It was a choice between the safety of invisibility and the terrifying, uncertain potential of being seen. The decision to act settled not as a brave resolution, but as a grim necessity. Mia understood that leaving the laptop and disappearing was the sensible choice, but the spreadsheet showing thousands of jobs evaporating into zeros had imprinted itself on her mind. It was a pattern she recognized. The powerful making decisions that devastated the powerless, all while shielding themselves from the consequences. She felt a fierce, protective instinct not for the company, but for the faceless numbers that represented real people. Her plan, born from a street-smart blend of directness and naivety, was simple. They wouldn't take the laptop. That was too risky and too complex. Instead, they would take the proof. Using the surprisingly intuitive interface, she found the print command and selected a single page, the damning spreadsheet comparing the current workforce with the projected post-acquisition numbers. The quiet whir of the conference room printer sounded like a siren in the silent office, each second stretching their nerves taut. When the page emerged, warm and crisp, it felt like a sacred text. Armed with their single sheet of paper, their mission was to get it into the hands of the only person who mattered, Evelyn Reed. They didn't know the corporate protocol for delivering a sensitive document, so they defaulted to the only method they knew, a direct, person-to-person delivery. They would find her office and give it to her themselves, a plan so audaciously simple it was destined to fail. Yet it was the only one they could conceive in a world whose rules were utterly alien to them. Their journey to the executive floor was a tense navigation through a landscape of quiet judgment. Every employee they passed seemed to track their grimy clothes and worn-out sneakers with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. They were anomalies, glitches in the pristine corporate matrix, and they could feel the system silently working to expel them. Reaching the top floor, they were met with a new kind of barrier, not a locked door, but a human one. A formidable executive assistant with perfectly coiffed hair and a gaze that could freeze water. She presided over a large, imposing desk that served as a gatekeeper to the CEO's inner sanctum. Mia, clutching the folded piece of paper, stepped forward while Lena hung back, her small frame partially hidden behind a large potted plant. "We need to see Evelyn Reed," Mia said, her voice small but steady. "It's important." The assistant didn't even look up from her screen at first, her fingers continuing to type. After a moment she sighed, a sound of profound annoyance, and finally lifted her eyes. She took in their appearance in a single, sweeping glance, and her professional neutrality hardened into a mask of cold dismissal. "I'm sorry, Ms. Reed does not take unscheduled appointments," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "If you have something to deliver, you can leave it with security at the main entrance." Mia held out the paper. "No, we have to give it to her. It's about a project." The assistant's smile was thin and sharp. "I'm sure it is," she said, before discreetly pressing a button under her desk. The incident was translated into a sterile, one-line summary in the daily security briefing that landed on Evelyn Reed's tablet. 1432. Two unidentified female juveniles, approximately ages 8 to 12, escorted from executive floor, attempted to gain access to CEO's office. No immediate threat identified? Evelyn swiped it away without a second thought. Her mind was consumed by the far larger threat of the hostile takeover. She was in the middle of a conference call with her legal team in Zurich, dissecting the financial weak points of their aggressor, plotting a counteroffensive that was both elegant and brutal. To her, the security alert was just noise, a minor system anomaly in a building full of thousands of people. The idea that two street children could have any relevance to her high-stakes corporate war was not just unlikely. It was patently absurd. Her world was one of firewalls, encrypted communications, and non-disclosure agreements. Information was a weapon, and access was meticulously controlled. She trusted her systems, both human and digital, to insulate her from the chaos of the outside world, allowing her to focus on the battles that truly mattered. The dismissal was instantaneous and absolute. She had built walls around her company and herself for a reason, and they were working as intended. The brief, bizarre incident was purged from her mind before her Swiss lawyer had even finished his sentence, a meaningless flicker of static in a day defined by strategic warfare. However, that same security briefing also landed on the desktop of Markinson, a junior analyst in Evelyn's internal strategy division, a small, trusted team working directly on the takeover defense. His job was to sift through all internal data, including seemingly mundane reports, looking for any anomalies that might indicate an information leak or internal threat. He, too, initially dismissed the entry about the two children. It was strange, but irrelevant. He was about to archive the report when a small handwritten addendum from the head of security caught his eye. The note, added for completeness, read, "Juveniles were insistent. Mentioned they had information for CEO regarding Project Nightingale." Markinson froze, his hand hovering over the mouse. He read the line again. It couldn't be right. Project Nightingale was the internal code name for their entire defense strategy. It was a name known only to 5 people in the entire world: Evelyn Reed, 2 board members, the head of legal, and himself. It existed on a single air-gapped server and was never spoken of in emails or phone calls. It was the most closely guarded secret in the company. For that name to come from the mouths of 2 children who had wandered in off the street was not just an anomaly, it was an impossibility. The sanitized report had been noise to Evelyn, but this single, terrifying detail was a piercing alarm bell to Markinson. A shiver of cold dread ran down his spine. The fortress had been breached, not by a rival corporation's hackers, but in a way he couldn't possibly comprehend, and the first warning sign had just been delivered by 2 little girls. Evelyn Reed did not grant audiences. She conducted strategic assessments. When her analyst, Markinson, burst into her office, bypassing her executive assistant with a look of pale terror, she was prepared to fire him on the spot. But his words stopped her cold. Project Nightingale. They know the code name. He explained the security log, the addendum from the guard, and the sheer impossibility of the situation. To Evelyn, the logic was simple. Information doesn't just appear. It is moved, stolen, or leaked. Her immediate conclusion was that the rival corporation had found a new, unorthodox way to breach her walls, using street children as unwitting or witting messengers to sow chaos and test her defenses. The story of finding a keycard and a laptop was, to her analytical mind, a fabricated cover for a much more sophisticated intelligence operation. Yet the paradox remained. Why use such a clumsy, unreliable delivery system? Why not leak the information to the press? It made no tactical sense. This illogical element was a loose thread in an otherwise perfect tapestry of corporate warfare, and Evelyn had an obsessive need to pull on any loose thread until the entire pattern was revealed. She decided to meet them not out of curiosity or compassion for the children, but out of a cold, strategic necessity. She needed to see the messengers for herself, to analyze their behavior, to dissect their story and find the puppet master pulling their strings. It was a data-gathering exercise, an interrogation disguised as a meeting. "Bring them to my boardroom," she commanded Markinson, her voice devoid of emotion. "And bring security. I want to know who sent them." The Omnigen boardroom was a temple to minimalist power, dominated by a 20-foot slab of polished black granite that served as a table. The air was cool and smelled faintly of leather and ozone from the integrated electronics. Into this sterile sanctuary, Mia and Lena were escorted. They looked like 2 small, smudged ghosts, their worn-out clothes a jarring disruption to the room's severe monochrome aesthetic. Lena clung to Mia's hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror, staring at the floor-to-ceiling window that displayed the city like a conquered territory. Mia, however, met the gaze of the 3 adults waiting for them. At the head of the table sat Evelyn Reed, her posture radiating an authority so absolute it felt like a physical force. To her right stood a hulking man with a grim face and an earpiece, the head of security. To her left was the nervous-looking analyst Markinson, who refused to meet their eyes. The girls were not offered a seat. They simply stood on the plush grey carpet before the table, a vast expanse of polished stone separating them from their interrogator. The silence stretched, a deliberate tactic by Evelyn to amplify their discomfort. In that silence, Mia felt the full weight of their decision. They were no longer invisible. They were specimens under a microscope, and she wasn't sure if they had walked into a rescue or a trap. Evelyn began without preamble, her voice as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "I'm told you have some information for me." She gestured toward the single, folded piece of paper the security chief had placed on the table, the printout they had taken from the laptop. "And that you know a word you have no business knowing. Start from the beginning, and do not lie to me. I will know." Mia swallowed hard, her throat dry. She recounted the story exactly as it had happened. The rain, the lost keycard, the open laptop in the empty conference room. As she spoke, she watched the expressions of the adults. The security chief's face was a mask of open disbelief, occasionally shaking his head slightly. Evelyn's expression remained unreadable, her eyes cold and analytical, processing every word for inconsistencies. "That story is not plausible," the security chief interrupted, his voice a low growl. "Our security protocols would have prevented it at every step." Evelyn held up a hand to silence him, her eyes still locked on Mia. "So you, a child who has never been inside a corporate building before, found our vice president's laptop, bypassed its security, navigated our confidential files, and understood our most sensitive financial projections?" The question was layered with deep, cutting skepticism. It was here that the mutual distrust became a palpable force in the room. Evelyn saw two pawns in a rival's game. Mia saw another powerful adult who refused to believe that someone like her could be capable of anything but begging or stealing. She needed this woman to trust her, but every instinct honed on the street screamed that people with this much power were the most dangerous of all. Frustration and a surge of desperate anger rose in Mia. They weren't being heard. They were being dismissed. She could see them building a narrative in their heads where she and Lena were liars, sent by someone else. "We didn't understand all of it," Mia blurted out, her voice rising, "but we understood the part about the jobs. The chart that showed people being erased." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "A chart that could have been given to you." This was the crux of it. They believed she was coached, reaching for a detail, any detail that wasn't on the single printed page they held. Mia's mind raced back to the screen. "There was more," she insisted. "Emails. They were talking about the people in the tech division, something about capping their severance." She stumbled over the unfamiliar word. "Capping the severance packages to reallocate funds for executive retention bonuses." It was a specific, ugly detail she had read, a phrase that had stuck in her mind because of its blatant unfairness. At the mention of it, she saw a flicker of movement. Markinson, the analyst, stiffened almost imperceptibly, his eyes darting towards his boss. It was a minute reaction, but it was there. He knew that phrase. He knew it was real. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that it was a detail buried so deep in the strategy documents that no one outside the inner circle could possibly have seen it. Evelyn caught his reaction. For the first time, a crack appeared in her cold, controlled facade. Her skepticism, built on a foundation of logic and experience, was now at war with an impossible, undeniable piece of data. She looked at Mia, truly looked at her, and the assessment changed. This was no longer just an interrogation. The moment the boardroom door closed on the two girls, Evelyn Reed's entire demeanor shifted from icy interrogation to that of a wartime commander. The impossible had been proven plausible, and she now operated under the assumption that her fortress had been breached. Her orders to Markinson and her head of security were swift, precise, and absolute. They were to conduct a full, deep background investigation on the senior vice president, the owner of the laptop, under the highest level of secrecy. It was to be a digital ghost operation, leaving no trace. While the girls were moved to a quiet, comfortable office with food and water, an act that was part containment, part newfound, confusing respect, Evelyn's internal security team went to work. They didn't just analyze the laptop, they dissected the man's entire digital life. They unearthed encrypted communication logs from his corporate devices, cross-referencing them with his personal network traffic. They ran financial forensics that peeled back layers of shell corporations until they found a newly created offshore account in the Cayman Islands that had received two substantial payments, the origin of which was masked, but the timing was damning, coinciding perfectly with key stages of the rivals' takeover bid. The evidence mounted with sickening speed. The VP wasn't just careless, he was a mole. He had been systematically leaking OmniGen's most sensitive data for months, using a sophisticated dead drop system online. The laptop being left open in the conference room was now recontextualized. It wasn't a simple mistake. He had likely been in the middle of a data transfer or communicating with his handlers when he was called into an emergency meeting about the very crisis he was facilitating, forcing him to leave in a hurry. The children hadn't just stumbled upon a document, they had walked into a traitor's nest at the exact moment he had left the door unlocked. When Markinson and the head of security presented their findings to Evelyn a few hours later, the atmosphere in the boardroom was funerary. The information they detailed was far worse than a simple leak of strategy. The traitorous VP hadn't just provided a copy of the Project Nightingale defense plan, he had provided a running commentary, a real-time guide to its weaknesses. He had given the rival corporation OmniGen's internal financial stress tests, patent vulnerability assessments, and key personnel psychological profiles, essentially handing them a meticulously crafted blueprint on how to dismantle the company from the inside out. The rivals' takeover bid wasn't just hostile. It was a surgically precise attack, armed with illegal insider knowledge at every turn. The documents revealed a conspiracy that went beyond corporate espionage into outright criminal fraud. The rival had been shorting OmniGen stock through proxies based on the leaked information, profiting from the very instability they were creating. The plan was to acquire OmniGen for a fraction of its worth by exploiting vulnerabilities that they only knew existed because the VP had sold them. The information the girls had found was the linchpin to the entire scheme. Without their accidental discovery, Evelyn would have been fighting a war where her opponent knew her every move before she made it. A battle she would have almost certainly lost, resulting in the complete dissolution of her company and the termination of over 20,000 employees. Evelyn received the news with a terrifying stillness. There was no outburst, no visible shock. Instead, a cold, silent fury settled deep in her eyes. It was the fury of a creator watching her creation being systematically poisoned from within by someone she had trusted, someone she had elevated to a position of immense power. The betrayal was absolute, but beneath the rage, her mind was already working, processing, and recalculating. The game had changed entirely. She was no longer on the defensive. The rival corporation's entire strategy was built on a foundation of criminal conspiracy, and now, thanks to two homeless children, she had the proof. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. She now held a weapon capable of not just ending the takeover bid, but of utterly destroying the rival company's leadership, exposing their illegal activities to federal regulators and the world. It was a checkmate position they didn't even know she possessed. And in the midst of this strategic recalibration, a profound and unsettling thought surfaced. She had built a billion-dollar fortress with the best security money could buy, yet it had been breached. And it was saved not by her firewalls or her highly paid security team, but by the chance intervention of two girls who existed in a world her fortress was designed to keep out. The sheer, staggering irony of it, that her life's work was saved by the most powerless and invisible members of society, was a truth so disruptive it shook the very foundations of her worldview. Leaving her team to begin drafting a legal and corporate counteroffensive, Evelyn walked to the office where Mia and Lena were waiting. The suspicion was gone from her posture, replaced by a heavy, complex gravity. She found them huddled together on a sofa, asleep, with a half-eaten plate of sandwiches on the table. She watched them for a long moment, these two small, fragile architects of her company's salvation. Waking them gently, she sat across from them, not as a CEO interrogating suspects, but as someone delivering life-altering news. She explained it in the simplest terms she could manage. "The man whose computer you found," she began, her voice softer than they had heard it before, "was a bad person. He was secretly helping people who wanted to destroy this company and hurt everyone who works here." She saw their eyes widen as they processed her words. "You didn't just find a secret," she continued, leaning forward slightly. "You found the traitor. Because of what you did, because you were brave enough to bring it to us, you stopped them." In that moment, Mia and Lena finally understood the true magnitude of their actions. It wasn't just about a spreadsheet or a secret project. They had seen the shift in the adults' faces, from disbelief to awe, and now they saw the truth in the eyes of the most powerful woman they had ever met. They had not just stumbled into a game. They had, against all odds, become its most important players, and the earthquake they had triggered in this world of glass and steel was only just beginning to be felt. The aftermath of the revelation was not a loud public explosion, but a series of swift, silent, and devastatingly precise maneuvers orchestrated by Evelyn Reed. Armed with irrefutable proof of criminal conspiracy, she did not go to the press or federal regulators. That would have created a scandal that would have inevitably damaged OmniGen's reputation in the fallout. Instead, she arranged a single private video conference with the board of directors of the rival corporation. In the sterile quiet of her boardroom, with her legal team present but silent, she laid out the evidence with cold, surgical precision. The offshore payment records, the encrypted communications, the logs of the data theft. She presented it not as an accusation, but as an unalterable fact. Her terms were not a negotiation, they were a directive. The hostile takeover bid was to be publicly withdrawn within 24 hours, citing unforeseen market volatility, a private settlement for corporate damages, a staggering 9-figure sum, would be transferred to a designated OmniGen account within 7 days. And the CEO of the rival company, along with every executive implicated in the scheme, was to resign effective immediately, their departures explained away as personal decisions or early retirements. The implicit threat hung unspoken in the air. Comply with these terms, or this evidence goes to the Department of Justice, and your company will cease to exist by the end of the quarter. The rival board, faced with total annihilation, capitulated completely. It was a silent, bloodless victory that left Evelyn more powerful than ever, having crushed her enemy entirely behind the impenetrable walls of corporate secrecy. With the external war won, Evelyn turned her attention to the two impossibly small soldiers who had handed her the victory. She knew that simply giving them a large sum of money would be a disservice, a careless act that would solve their immediate problems but leave them vulnerable to a world that preys on the unprepared. This was not a debt that could be settled with a simple transaction. It required a structural solution. She met with Mia and Lena again in a much warmer, less intimidating office, a space with soft chairs and natural light. She explained to them that the danger was over and that the people who had been trying to hurt her company had been stopped. Then she laid out her plan for them. "What you did was more valuable than any business deal I have ever made," she said, her voice carrying a sincerity that was entirely new to them. "A reward isn't enough. I want to offer you a different path." She explained that she had established a private trust in their names, one that would be managed by her most trusted financial advisor. This trust would not only provide for all their living expenses, but would also fund their complete education. She had already secured 2 full scholarships at a prestigious, highly secure boarding school in the countryside, a place where they would have access to the best teachers, resources, and, most importantly, a stable and safe environment to simply be children. It was an offer not just of wealth, but of a future, a complete rewriting of the destiny that had been assigned to them. The transition was a dizzying blur for Mia and Lena. One week, they were mapping out the safest alleyways to sleep in. The next, they were being fitted for school uniforms and meeting with child psychologists hired by Evelyn to help them acclimate. The news of the hostile takeover's withdrawal was a minor headline in the financial papers, the corporate world accepting the official story without a second thought. The traitorous VP at Omnigen vanished from the company roster, his sudden health-related retirement barely causing a ripple. For Mia and Lena, the consequences were far more immediate and visceral. They were moved from the Omnigen tower to a fully furnished, secure apartment with a dedicated caregiver, a kind woman who didn't flinch at their street-honed habits. The sheer quiet of having a room of their own, a bed that was always there, and a refrigerator that was always full, was a profound shock to their systems. Lena, for the first time, collected toys. Mia, surrounded by books, began to read with a voracious appetite. There was fear, of course, a deep-seated anxiety about this new world and its unspoken rules, a worry that it could all be taken away as quickly as it had been given. But holding them together, as always, was their unbreakable bond. They were facing this strange, intimidating new life the same way they had faced the old one, together. They were no longer just survivors. They were architects of a future they were just beginning to learn how to build. In the end, the encounter in the glass tower left no one unchanged. Evelyn Reed remained at the helm of Omnigen, her reputation as a formidable leader, now legendary in the circles that mattered. But something within her had shifted. She had won, but she understood that her victory was owed entirely to a chance encounter she would have deemed impossible. She quietly started a new, anonymous philanthropic foundation dedicated to creating educational pathways for at-risk youth, a penance and a tribute to the 2 girls who had saved her. Markinson, the analyst who had seen the red flag, was promoted to a senior strategic role, his career now on a fast track, his defining professional trait being a tendency to investigate the anomalies everyone else ignored. And Mia and Lena, now miles away at their new school, were slowly, cautiously stepping into their new lives. They were learning about algebra and history, but they were also learning about trust and stability. The story never became public, a secret shared only by a handful of people. Yet its impact was the most profound truth of all, that the intricate, fortified systems of power are often more fragile than they appear, and their fate can be altered in an instant by the courage of those who have nothing to lose and the wisdom of those who are finally willing to see them. For more stories that matter, join our community. Subscribe to Jabot Stories.